The letter arrived on a Tuesday, tucked between a bill from the coal merchant and a circular from the Ladies' Auxiliary that Leonora Ashby had long since stopped reading. It was written on heavy cream stationery, the kind that cost more than a week of the modest salary she drew as a cataloguer for the Hartwell County Historical Society. The handwriting on the envelope was decisive, almost impatient, as though the pen had somewhere better to be. Inside was an offer of employment. Lord Cavendish Morley, the Earl of Dunmorrow, required a private archivist to bring order to the contents of Dunmorrow Hall's East Wing Library. The collection, according to the letter drafted by his solicitor, had not been properly assessed in 40 years. The salary offered was more than twice what Leonora currently earned. She read the letter twice, set it on the kitchen table beside her tea, and looked out the window at the narrow Halifax street, where her neighbour was wrestling an umbrella against the November wind. She had heard of Dunmorrow Hall. Everyone in the county had. The estate sat on a broad promontory above the sea, its grey stone visible from the coast road on clear days. The Morley family had held the land for 300 years. The current Earl was known to be difficult. That was the word people used. Difficult, in the careful way they use it, when the more accurate word would embarrass everyone in the room. He had returned from a long posting abroad 2 years ago, and had spent the intervening time reducing his household staff and dismissing 3 different estate managers in rapid succession. Leonora needed the work. That was the simple truth she allowed herself to hold without sentiment. Her father, a third son of a minor branch of the Ashby family, had died the previous spring, leaving behind a modest library, a great deal of goodwill from people who could not repay it, and debts that had required the sale of the family home. She was 27 years old, well educated, and in possession of skills that were genuinely useful in a world that found them genuinely inconvenient in a woman of her background. She accepted the position by return post. Dunmorrow Hall was larger than she had anticipated and colder than she could have imagined. Mrs. Rowley, the housekeeper, was a compact woman with a permanent expression of brisk competence who showed Leonora to her rooms on the first afternoon, with the efficiency of someone who had learned not to grow attached to the people who occupied them. The East Wing Library, Mrs. Rowley explained, had been locked since the late Countess passed. That had been 11 years ago. Nobody had been inside it since. The lock was stiff. The hinges complained. The smell that met Leonora when she finally pushed the door open was the smell she loved most in the world. Old paper, dried leather, the particular cold dust of undisturbed time. The room was enormous. Floor-to-ceiling shelves lined 3 walls, and a gallery ran along the upper level with a wrought iron rail thinly laced with rust. Trunks and boxes were stacked along the center of the room with no visible system. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, feeling the peculiar pleasure of a task that would require genuine effort. She met the Earl 3 days after her arrival. She had been on her hands and knees beside one of the trunks, carefully lifting out a bundle of correspondence tied with ribbon that had faded from red to a dusty rose. When she heard footsteps on the parquet behind her, she rose and turned, and found herself facing a man who was watching her with the particular expression of someone who has not expected to find another person in a room they consider entirely their own. He was taller than she'd expected, dark-coated, no cravat. His sleeves turned back at the cuffs in a way that suggested he had come directly from something else and found her here by accident. His eyes were a light brown that in certain light looked almost amber, and they moved over the room with the slightly pained expression of a man assessing damage. Leonora introduced herself. He acknowledged this with a nod that conveyed neither warmth nor hostility, only the mild surprise of a man who has forgotten. He hired someone. "You'll bring me a report," he said, "when you've had time to assess the scope of it." "Of course, my lord." He looked at the trunk she had been working beside, at the letters she had set carefully on the table, and then at her. Something shifted faintly in his expression. Not softness exactly, but a recalibration. "My mother collected everything," he said. It was not said with affection. Then he left. She heard his footsteps retreat down the corridor, and then the old house settled back into its habitual silence. She did not see him again for 2 weeks. The library kept her entirely occupied. It was not merely a collection of books, it was the accumulated record of a family across generations. There were estate ledgers going back to the 1780s, personal correspondence, journals, household accounts, maps, deeds, a curious collection of press botanical specimens interleaved between the pages of a large atlas, 3 crates of architectural drawings for buildings she could not identify. She worked methodically, beginning with inventory before organization, resisting the archivist's perpetual temptation to stop and read everything. It was in the 3rd week that she found the letter. It was bundled with estate correspondence from 1889, folded in thirds, and addressed in a handwriting she had begun to recognize as the 5th Earl's, Cavendish Morley's grandfather. It was a letter to a solicitor, and it was not, strictly speaking, any of her concern. She nearly set it aside unread, as she had learned to do with personal family correspondence. But the word settlement caught her eye, and then the name of the farm, Caldwell's Point, and then the phrase, "The matter is to be kept entirely from the tenants." She read it. She read it twice. Then she sat very still for a long time, listening to the wind off the sea moving through the gaps in the old window frames. Caldwell's Point was not a name she would have recognized 2 weeks ago, but she had been cataloguing estate maps, and she knew now that it was a 200-acre farm on the southern boundary of the Dunmorrow estate. She knew that the family who worked it, the Caulfields, had farmed it for 4 generations. She knew, from a separate bundle of household accounts, that they had paid their rent reliably for every one of those generations. What she had not known until this letter was that the land had never actually belonged to the Morley estate at all. The letter was followed by others once she knew what she was looking for. The 5th Earl had, in the 1880s, acquired an adjacent parcel of land through a boundary agreement with a neighbor whose estate was failing. The agreement should have been registered through the county land office. It had not been. The land had instead been folded quietly into the Dunmorrow holdings, and the Caulfield family, who had farmed Caldwell's Point under a verbal arrangement with the previous owner, had simply continued to pay rent. Now to the Morleys, without ever being told that the legal title to the land was, at best, questionable, and at worst, entirely invalid. For 60 years, 3 generations of Caulfields had paid rent on land that the Morley family had no clean legal right to collect. Leonora assembled the evidence with the same careful precision she brought to everything. She did not allow herself to rush or to feel. Not yet she found the original boundary agreement. She found the correspondence with the county office that had never been completed. She found the rent rolls decade after decade, the Caulfield name appearing with relentless regularity, always paid in full. When she had finished, she had a folder of documents that told a clear, incontrovertible story. She sat at the long table in the library and looked at that folder for a very long time. Her father's voice came to her, as it sometimes did, a gentleman with an inconvenient habit of moral clarity. He had once told her that honesty is not a quality you admire in others. It is a practice you maintain yourself, or it means nothing at all. She requested a meeting with the Earl through Mrs. Rowley. The housekeeper received this with a look of careful neutrality. His lordship is occupied with the estate accounts this week. Miss Ashby. I understand, when he has time. The summons came on a Thursday evening. The study was on the ground floor, overlooking the sea-facing garden. It was a working room. Maps on the desk, ledgers stacked on the side table, a fire burning with practical rather than ornamental intent. The Earl was standing at the window when she entered, and he did not immediately turn. When he did, she saw that he was tired. Not the tiredness of a single late night, but the deeper kind that settles into a person over years. Mrs. Rowley said it concerned the archives. It does, my lord. She stepped forward and placed the folder on his desk. I've found something in the estate records that I believe requires your attention. I want to be direct with you about what it contains. He looked at the folder, then at her. Go on, she told him concisely. The boundary agreement, the unregistered title, 60 years of rent collected from a family who had no reason to know the land's legal status was compromised. She told him, without editorializing, keeping her voice steady and her words precise, the way she would present findings to the board of the Historical Society. When she finished, there was a long silence. The Earl picked up the folder. He opened it and looked at the first page, then the second. His face did not change, but something in his posture shifted, a very slight settling, as if weight had been added. You've been here 3 weeks, he said. Yes, my lord. And in 3 weeks you've managed to produce a document that implies my family has been defrauding their tenants for 6 decades. The documents are your family's own records, my lord. I've only organized what was already there. He set the folder down. When he looked at her, his expression was not the anger she had steeled herself for. It was something more complicated, a kind of held-in-check quality, like a man standing very still on unstable ground. My grandfather was considered a model landlord, he said. He's mentioned in the county history. I'm aware, Leonora said. I catalogued the copy in your library 2 days ago. Something moved behind his eyes. You're suggesting that reputation was built on a fraudulent land claim. I'm not suggesting anything, my lord. I'm presenting what the records show. What you do with that information is not my decision to make. He turned back to the window. She could see the garden below, the November grass flat and grey in the fading light, and beyond it, the dark line of the sea. You could have said nothing, he said. It was not an accusation. It sounded almost like a question. Yes, Leonora said. I could have. Another silence. When he turned back, his expression had closed. This is a significant accusation to bring on the basis of 60-year-old correspondence. I'll want my solicitor to review this before any conclusions are drawn. He paused. You're an archivist, Miss Ashby, not a lawyer. That's correct, my lord. I'm an archivist. My responsibility is to the accuracy of the record. Your responsibility, he said, and his voice had taken on an edge she had not heard from him before, is to catalogue what is in that library, not to interpret it, not to make judgments about my family's history on the basis of incomplete information. It is. The information is not incomplete. It is. I have an estate to manage, he said, and the edge sharpened. I have tenants who depend on me, creditors I'm negotiating with, and an east wing that needs a new roof before spring. I did not hire you to come into my house and produce documents designed to damage my family's name. He moved to his side of the desk, putting it between them. The Caulfields have farmed that land for 4 generations. They know who their landlord is. This, he touched the folder briefly, would achieve nothing except to create doubt and discord where there is none. With respect, my lord, they are paying rent on land to which your family may have no legal right. They deserve to know that. Ah, they deserve to know, he repeated the phrase with a flatness that stripped it of meaning. You've been in this county for 3 weeks. The Caulfields have been here for 150 years. Do not tell me what they deserve. He paused. "I think we've reached the end of this conversation, Miss Ashby. You may return to your work in the library." She held his gaze for one beat, then two. She had said what needed to be said. She had placed the truth on his desk, in 11 carefully documented pages. He could choose to close his eyes to it, but she would not pretend alongside him. "I understand, my lord," she said. She picked up her notebook from the desk. She had brought it from habit, and walked to the door. "Miss Ashby," she turned. "Women in your position would be well advised to remember that positions such as yours are not difficult to fill." He said it without particular inflection, which made it worse. "There are any number of qualified people who could manage what you're doing." She looked at him for a moment. She thought of her father's library, sold piece by piece. She thought of the Caulfield name, appearing in those rent rolls decade after decade, in the careful handwriting of people who had trusted the word of a landlord they had no reason to doubt. "Then I suggest you find one of them," she said, and her voice was entirely even. "Good night, my lord." She turned and walked out. She pulled the door closed behind her, with a quiet click that seemed to settle something final into the air. She did not sleep well, not because she regretted what she had said, but because she had not expected the particular quality of her own calm. She had walked into that study knowing she might lose the position. She had walked out having said everything she intended to say, and nothing she did not. There was a kind of structural integrity in that, the way a load-bearing wall feels different from an ornamental one. She packed methodically. She had not brought much. 3 dresses, her father's copy of Montaigne, her field notebook, the botanical sketchbook she kept for her own pleasure. She had them in her valise before midnight. Mrs. Rowley appeared in the corridor at 6:30 in the morning with a wrapped parcel. "There's oatmeal in the kitchen," she said, "and the carrier comes through the village at 8. She pressed the parcel into Leonora's hands. It was a package of shortbread, still warm. "You're a sensible woman, Miss Ashby. Sensible women are wasted on houses like this one." It was, Leonora reflected, the most candid thing anyone had said to her in 3 weeks. She thanked Mrs. Rowley and meant it, and walked out into the grey December morning. The carrier's stop was at the crossroads, 1/2 mile down from the hall gates. The road was straight and cold, the frozen grass along the verge crackling faintly under her feet. She walked with her valise and her parcel of shortbread, and she did not look back at the house. She heard him before she saw him, footsteps on the road behind her, moving quickly, then faster. She stopped and turned, and he was coming down the drive at something between a walk and a run, his coat open, his breath clouding in the cold air. He was still in the clothes he had been wearing the night before. He slowed when he reached her. He stopped at a proper distance, which somehow made it worse, the formality of it after running down a county road in December. For a moment, he said nothing. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he has damaged and is trying to assess whether it can be repaired. "I read them," he said finally, "all of it. I was in the study until 4 in the morning." He paused. He was not a man who reached for words easily, that was clear. The correspondence with Hartley and Sons, the survey maps, the original boundary agreement. Another pause. "You were right." The carrier could be heard now, faintly, the wheels on the road from the north. "It's more than the Caulfields," he continued. "My solicitor will need to assess the full scope. The land records in the northeast corner of the estate. There may be others." He stopped. He looked at the valise in her hand, and then back at her face. "I spoke to you last night in a way that was—" He stopped again. Whatever word he had reached for didn't come. "I'm aware of what you said, Lord Morley," Leonora said. "Then you're also aware that I was wrong." He said it with a directness that cost him something. She could see that. "The folder you gave me was correct. The conclusions you drew were correct. I dismissed them because the alternative. He stopped, because looking at what my grandfather built and seeing that it rested on something rotten is not an easy thing, Leonora said. No. He looked at the road. The carrier was visible now, coming around the bend. I don't want you to go, he said it plainly, without ornamentation, not because I need someone to finish cataloguing the library, although that's true. Because, he breathed out, because you were the only person in 11 years who put something true on my desk and didn't apologize for it. She was quiet for a moment. If I stay, she said, this gets done properly. Legal review of every boundary on the estate. Direct communication with the Caulfields. Fair resolution, whatever the solicitor determines that means, and yes, and I work to the end of my own professional judgment, not to the end of what's convenient. Something that was not quite a smile moved across his face. I had gathered that. The carrier pulled up. The driver looked at them both with the practiced incuriosity of a man who has seen stranger things on rural roads. Leonora set her valise down on the frozen verge. Then I'll need access to the county land office records, she said, and I'll want your solicitor available on Wednesday. I'll arrange it. She picked up her valise. Not to hand to him, she carried it herself back toward the gate. He fell into step beside her, not quite alongside, one careful pace behind, as if respecting a boundary she had not yet given him permission to cross. The weeks that followed were unlike anything Dunmorrow Hall had seen in a long time. The dining room table that had once seated 20 now served as a working surface for maps, documents, and legal correspondence. Cavendish Morley, she still called him my lord, and he still called her Miss Ashby. But the terms had changed in quality, grown less formal in function, even as they remained formal in address. Cancelled 2 trips to Edinburgh and told his solicitor that the Dunmorrow estate review took precedence over everything else. The solicitor's assessment confirmed everything the documents had suggested. The Caldwell's Point title was legally compromised. There were 2 further properties in the northeast quarter, whose original survey records did not match the deeds held by the estate. 3 families across 2 generations had been paying rent on land to which the Morley title was, at minimum, contestable. Telling them was Cavendish's decision to make. He made it without hesitation. He went to each of the 3 farms himself, in his working coat with mud on his boots, and he said plainly what the records had revealed and what he intended to do about it. Leonora came with him the first time, at his request. She stood at a distance that was neither close enough to intrude, nor far enough to suggest she had nothing to do with it. Old Mr. Caulfield, who was 73 years old, and had spent his whole life on land his grandfather had broken and cleared, with his own hands listened to Cavendish's account without interruption. When it was finished, he was quiet for a long time. "My father always said your grandfather was a fair man," he said at last. Cavendish did not look away from that. "I'm sorry," he said, "for what it's worth to you." Mr. Caulfield looked at Leonora. She did not know what her face showed. Whatever it was, something in his own expression shifted. "Yes, sir. You're the archivist," he said. "Yes, sir. You found it. The records found it," she said. "I only read them." He nodded slowly. "Then the records are worth more than I thought." The legal process was not quick, and it was not inexpensive. Cavendish engaged a land solicitor from Halifax, which cost considerably more than the local firm, and was considerably more thorough. Deeds were redrawn. Back payments, what the solicitor calculated as the excess rent collected over and above what a legitimate lease would have commanded, were offered. 2 of the 3 families accepted. 1 did not, on principle, and Cavendish had the deed for their property transferred to their name outright, which was the only thing that seemed sufficient to the situation. He sold his grandfather's desk to fund part of it. It was a very fine piece, walnut and brass, and had been in the study since 1891. When Leonora asked, obliquely, whether he had considered other options, he said, "That desk sat in the room where those decisions were made. I don't want it." She did not argue with him. Spring came gradually to Dunmorrow the way it comes in that part of the coast, reluctantly in cold fits and starts, with sudden warm afternoons that vanished overnight. Leonora had, without particularly intending to, ceased to think of herself as temporary. The library was mostly ordered now, the inventory complete, a finding guide, drafted and cross-referenced. She had begun a separate project cataloguing the natural history materials, the pressed specimens, and the handwritten field notes from the third Countess, who had been a serious amateur botanist in an era that hadn't had a word for serious women. She was in the library one evening, the lamps lit against the early dark, when Cavendish appeared in the doorway in the way he sometimes did, not announcing himself, just standing there for a moment as if checking that the room was real. He had taken to stopping by in the evenings. It had started as practical discussions about the estate review, and had become something else gradually, in the way these things do, in the way you don't notice until you already miss them when they don't happen. "The third Countess," he said, looking at the botanical sketches spread on the table. "My grandmother used to mention her, said she was the most sensible woman the family had ever produced. She was remarkably systematic," Leonora said. "Her notation is better than most published herbaria I've worked with." He came to stand beside the table. He looked at the sketches for a moment. "Leonora," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name, and she felt the weight of it. Not presumptuous, but carefully placed as if he had been considering where to set it. She looked up. "I'd like to ask you something," he said, "and I'd like you to answer it as honestly as you've answered everything else." "All right," she said. He was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when he was assembling words he intended to mean. "You came here for a temporary engagement," he said, "and it has not been temporary, and it has not been what either of us expected, and I find," he paused, "I find that the prospect of it ending is something I'm not prepared to be sensible about." He looked at the table, at the botanical sketches, and then at her. "I'm not asking you to stay as my archivist. The archive is largely done. I'm asking you to stay because this house is better with you in it, because I am better with you in it, and I would very much like, if you were willing, to give that a proper name." She held his gaze. She thought of the morning she had walked down the coast road. With her valise, she thought of him running, his coat open in the December cold. She thought of Mr. Caulfield's face when he said, "You found it." She thought of the clean pages she had left in her notebook, the ones she had not yet decided what to fill with. "Cavendish," she said, and the sound of his name in her own voice settled something she had not known was unsettled. She placed her hand on the table between them. He covered it with his, the way two people do who have already decided something before either one has said it aloud. Outside, the April sea was beginning to calm. The new orchards were in bud. 3 families on the southern end of the estate were farming land that bore their own names on the deed now, properly registered, at the county land office. And in the east wing library of Dunmorrow Hall, where the lamps burned late into the evening, Leonora had begun a new journal at the back of the ledger she used for the collection inventory. Not in the pages of accounts and losses, in the clean pages at the back, the first entry read, "April. The wild roses on the north wall are returning.